Welcome. So I'm Chelsea Macias, museum educator for the Watka Museum. I will be today's moderator. So I will be moderating both the chat and Q&A functions. So these are the two main functions that you will be able to use to interact with our guest tonight. I will be recording this presentation. So this presentation will be available through the Watka Museum. Before I get started with introductions, I just want to begin by acknowledging that we present this program from the traditional lands of the Lummi and Nooksack people. Please be sure to contact the nations who are stewardess to this land for many generations. So definitely want to honor our Native and Indigenous populations. This presentation today is Travis Rideout's Hacking Democracy, What Social Media is Doing to US Politics. And this presentation is put together by the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau program. They have many programs throughout the year. Feel free to check out their website at www.humanities.org to find more Speaker Bureau's programs and other various programs as well. So for today's presentation, Travis Rideout will be your presenter. He has the Thomas S. Foley Distinguished Professor of Government and Public Policy at Washington State University. Rideout's research on political campaigns has appeared in the American Journal of Political Science, in the British Journal of Political Science, and in the Journal of Politics. Rideout's most recent book is Political Advertising in the United States. So without further ado, I'll pass it on over to Travis and let you take it from here. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. I do have some slides that I want to share with you this evening. And actually what I'm going to ask you to do to start off this evening is to think back to 20 years ago. Think back to the 2000 presidential election, and to refresh your memory, that man on the left there is George W. Bush, the Republican nominee in that year. The man on the right is Al Gore, the Democratic nominee in 2000. And you might remember that it was a very, very close election decided by a few hundred votes in the state of Florida. And in fact, if you search the recesses of your mind, you might even recall some terms like a hanging chad or a butterfly ballot, okay? Now my point is not necessarily to take a trip down memory lane, but it's to get you to think about the differences in campaigning today versus 20 years ago. And so if we're talking about campaigns 20 years ago, well, they did have websites, but they were more like brochures that were put online. There wasn't much interactivity like we have today. Of course, there was a lot of TV advertising. There were billboards. There were pamphlets that you received in the mail, people knocking on your door and dropping off brochures. All of that we have today. But there are some forms of campaigning that just didn't exist 20 years ago. And the chief one that I want to talk about this evening is the use of social media. And so here's a definition for you. Social media refers to forms of electronic communication, such as websites, through which people create online communities to share information, ideas, personal messages, etc. And one of the first forms of social media that was deployed in a campaign was the campaign blog. And that was used by Howard Dean, who ran for the Democratic nomination for president in 2004. His campaign blog, where you'd get updates from the campaign several times a day, was truly innovative back in 2003. In 2004, Facebook came on the scene, though I couldn't actually find any evidence of the campaigns using Facebook in that year, but I did find the presidential candidates' Facebook pages from 2008. In 2005, as our internet speeds started increasing, we were able to watch video online. And of course, YouTube was the 10,000-pound gorilla in that enterprise. And in 2006, Twitter first appeared. And in 2010, it was Instagram. So campaigns could share images from the campaign. And of course, since that time, there have been other social media platforms that have come and gone as well. You might think of Snapchat, you might think of TikTok. There are probably others out there that my students know all about and that I'm blissfully ignorant of. So, and the other big change, of course, is the appearance of banner ads, pop-up ads that are everywhere as we surf the internet. Okay, so let me give you some hard numbers here on the rise of digital advertising on social media and other websites. This figure is showing you the amount spent on political ads in each of the past 5 election cycles that's devoted to digital spending. So on social media, on websites, and so on. And in the 2009-2010 election cycle, that barely registers, but it creeps up in 2012, again in 2014. By 2016, it is $1.4 billion that is being spent on political advertising, digital political advertising, I should say. And by the 2017-2018 election cycle, it is $1.8 billion. Now, the final numbers aren't in from our current election cycle, but I can guarantee you that it's going to be well over that figure from 2018. This figure displays these data in a slightly different way. This figure shows you the share of political advertising that is digital advertising in the United States in each of the past 5 election cycles. Ranges from near zero in 2010 to 14% in 2016, a little over 20% in 2018. The best estimates I've seen for this current election cycle are that digital ad spending will constitute 27% of total ad spending. Here's one more big number for you, $1.78 billion. That's the amount that campaigns have spent on political ads on Facebook since May of 2018. So hopefully I've convinced you that advertising on social media, it's a thing nowadays. And well, here I have some questions for you. I feel almost silly asking these questions, but have you received an ad or political message from a political campaign in the past week? And if I could see you all and you are raising your hands, I would guess that almost everyone would say yes to this question, right? Political ads online, they're ubiquitous nowadays. And that actually has some advantages for voters, I think. One is that it allows for two-way communication. So not just campaigns sending messages to you, but you being able to talk back to those campaigns. So you can tweet at a candidate, you can ask the candidate a question on that candidate's Facebook page, for instance, and hopefully even get a response. And secondly, it just provides for a wealth of information that may not have been available in the past. That might range from policy information, so what the candidate's positions are on the major issues of the day, but it also provides a chance for you to get to know these candidates as individuals. People talk about the personalization of politics nowadays. So now we can see what the candidates ate for breakfast, for instance, or hear what their favorite movie is, or their favorite sports team, or in the case of Beto O'Rourke earlier this year, he live streamed his appointment with the dentist. Perhaps too much information, but you can see how that has really changed as a result of social media. But social media also have some pretty big advantages for political campaigns. And one of those chief advantages is the ability to target messages. Now, targeting particular messages to particular voters isn't necessarily a brand new thing. Campaigns have engaged in forms of targeting for a long time, granted, but there is a special type of targeting that I'm going to talk about in a minute that has been facilitated by social media. And so the three main types of targeting that campaigns engage in are first, geographic targeting. So in the presidential race, for instance, that means airing a bunch of ads in Florida or Ohio, those swing states this year, and avoiding advertising in Washington State or Utah. It could also be more narrow geographic targeting, such as sending your message only to voters who live in a particular precinct, a precinct that has generally supported your campaign in the past, for instance. A second form of targeting is group-based targeting. So this means sending tailored messages to individuals based on their demographic characteristics or their interests. So maybe we send particular ads to young Latina women, for instance, or we send messages to people who have an interest in protecting the environment, would be another example. And finally, there is micro-targeting, and this is what has really opened up through our use of social media. This means sending specifically tailored messages to specific individual voters. So maybe you get a message, let's say it's about immigration. Your neighbor doesn't get any message. Your neighbor on the other side doesn't get a message either, but your other neighbor down the street gets a message that's tailored to, let's say, the issue of the environment. So we're sending or not sending messages based on your characteristics. And the content of those messages also depend on your particular characteristics. So let me talk a little bit more about how that micro-targeting is actually done. It generally starts with a large-scale survey of the geographic area in which you're campaigning. So maybe, let's say it's Washington State. And so we might interview a couple thousand people, ask them about their voting habits, how often in the past they voted, for instance. Maybe ask them about the partisan leanings, whether they're a strong Democrat, strong Republican, independent, and maybe their political ideology. Do they lean more conservative or liberal or moderate? And then we match up those data with data from the voter registration list that you can get from usually the Secretary of State's office in each state. And of course, that information indicates first and foremost whether you're a registered voter, but also in some states what party you're registered with. We don't have partisan registration in Washington, but in maybe about a third to half the states, there is that information where you actually are listed as a registered Republican or a registered Democrat or independent or something else. And that voter registration list also has information about how often in the past you voted. So did you actually vote in that August primary, for instance? Or are you the type who only votes in presidential elections? Okay, so we've got the survey data, we got the voter registration list. We add to that consumer data. You may or may not know that there are some big companies out there that have huge databases about each and every one of us that contain hundreds of pieces of information about our habits. Maybe it's the cable channels we subscribe to. It could be our newspaper subscriptions, or the magazines we subscribe to, or whether we pay our bills on time, or whether we bought diapers at Target last month. All sorts of information like that. And then we give all of these pieces of data, all matched up, to the tech geeks on the campaign or a microtargeting firm, and they run the numbers and create profiles of mobilization and persuasion targets. So mobilization targets, those individuals that we think will probably vote for us, but need a little push to convince them to turn out to vote. Persuasion targets are those individuals that we think might vote for us with a little bit of persuading, okay? And then we'll work with the social media platforms to send our messages to those individuals whom we want to target. And so if we provide Facebook with a list of names and maybe associated email addresses, they claim they can match 60 to 80% of those individuals with people in their database. And so we're essentially telling them this individual, that person gets this ad, okay? And so that's in essence how this works. Now, here's a bit of an odd question, but do you drive a Jaguar? Do you drive a Subaru? Do you drive a Plymouth? Actually, knowing this information is actually informative to political campaigns. Let me show you how, okay? So look at this figure here. On the left, we have car drivers who are more Democratic. On the right, those who are more Republican, okay? Towards the top are those who are high turnout individuals. They almost always turn out to vote. And towards the bottom are low turnout individuals. They rarely turn out to vote. So let's look in the top right corner. You'll see the Porsche and the Jaguar. And so people who drive those vehicles tend to be high turnout Republicans. And so if you're a Democratic campaign, you might say, let's not bother contacting those individuals. If you're a Republican campaign, you might say the same thing. Hey, they're guaranteed to vote, and they're going to vote for our side. Look in the top left corner. We've got those Subaru drivers. Well, they're high turnout Democrats. Look in the lower left quadrant. You see those Plymouth drivers. Well, they tend to be Democrats, but they're low turnout, which means if you're a Democratic campaign, you want to hit up those individuals with a mobilization message. Now look at those people right in the middle who drive Kias. We got a mix of Republicans, a mix of Democrats. That might indicate that there are persuasion targets among Kia drivers. And so maybe both sides want to speak to those individuals. We can even look at people's favorite adult beverage and learn something about their politics as well. You'll see in the upper left, drinkers of Sauvignon Blanc tend to be high turnout Democrats, whereas high turnout Republicans tend to like a Canadian whiskey, for instance. And I guess everyone likes Bud Light right in the middle. So, now, I'm not saying there's a one-to-one correspondence here between the vehicle you drive and which alcoholic beverage you happen to consume. But if we combine this information with some other information about you, your consumer habits, your voting history, things we infer about you based upon our survey data, then we can make some pretty good guesses as to how Democratic or how Republican you're going to be, and how likely or unlikely you are to turn out to vote. So there are some advantages of this microtargeting for the voter. One is that candidates are more likely to speak about the issues that individuals care about. So through all their research on you, they know that, say, you're concerned about the environment. And so they're going to send you messages about the environment, which makes your job of figuring out which candidate is better on the environment a lot easier. That said, there are a lot of concerns about microtargeting as well. One concern is that it reinforces voter polarization. That idea that Democrats are becoming even more Democratic and Republicans are becoming even more Republican. And the idea here is that people aren't hearing from the other side. They're only hearing from their own side. And so it's no wonder then that they're becoming more firm in their own partisanship. Another concern is that campaigns are giving different appeals to different voters, which means post-election, there may be no agreement on what that campaign was about, or what our new president or Senate or House, what issues they need to act on. Because all I heard was messages about immigration, but my neighbor only heard messages about healthcare. A third concern is that microtargeting techniques tend to ignore the infrequent voter. So they may have you labeled as someone who never votes, and thus they think, well, it's a waste to contact you, and therefore you receive even fewer contacts, which makes it even less likely that you're going to turn out to vote. Another concern is invasion of privacy. How do you feel knowing that all these companies have all these pieces of information about you? And not only that, that they're selling this information to politicians. I have my concerns about that. And one of the chief concerns we've heard about in connection with microtargeting over the past few years is the potential for voter manipulation. You might define this as convincing someone to vote against his or her best interests. And to put it more bluntly, some people have asked whether Russia stole the presidential election in 2016. And the way this story usually goes, it brings in the British microtargeting firm, Cambridge Analytica, which, as the story goes, created sophisticated profiles, psychological profiles of millions of Americans based on some data about their habits on Facebook. Now, it's disputed whether they stole that data from Facebook or Facebook was just negligent in not preventing them from accessing that data. But that's usually the story about how people were manipulated by these ads. Cambridge Analytica had a sort of connection with Russian actors. And so the story goes, Russia stole the presidential election. And it's certain Russia tried to interfere in our election in 2016, and they're trying to interfere in 2020 as well. I think it's important to point out a few things, though. First of all, Cambridge Analytica was hired by the Trump campaign to work for them, just as The Clinton campaign in 2016 had hired its own microtargeting firms, and just as the Biden campaign in 2020 has its own microtargeting firms. Second, through interviews with insiders at the company, we learned that Cambridge Analytica was not necessarily any more sophisticated than any other microtargeting firm. Yes, they had access to all of these data from Facebook. Turns out they really couldn't get their algorithms to work very well. And at the end of the day, they decided that this technique they were pursuing wasn't actually working out. I think another thing worth pointing out is that the Clinton campaign spent more on social media in 2016 than the Trump campaign did, though the Trump campaign spent a greater proportion of its resources on social media. And that same pattern continues in 2020. The Biden campaign has spent a lot more than the Trump campaign, but on social media, well, they were in September. Now the Trump campaign is has a little advantage in the past week. But the Trump campaign is definitely putting more of its resources, a greater percentage of its resources, into social media advertising. So all that said, I think there are a lot of concerns that remain about the role of social media in the current campaign. First of all, why did Facebook allow the use of our personal information? I don't think the company is given a good accounting of that. Second of all, these Russian efforts to sow division that relied upon social media oftentimes appealed to our most base instincts. There were a lot of sexist memes, sexist advertisements, racist, Islamophobic. You can see in the top right corner, pure evil with Hillary Clinton. And there was also just a lack of transparency. So who was sponsoring all of these ads that ran on these social media platforms in 2016? Look again at that Hillary Clinton ad in the top right corner. It's from a group called Heart of Texas. I don't know if you can see that or not, but who is Heart of Texas? I don't know. And no one knew in 2016. No one knew who was backing them or where their money was coming from. We just didn't have that information. And so this begs the question, are we prepared for 2020? And I think there are some reasons for optimism. For one, the public is more aware of these efforts to influence them through advertising, through misinformation that is spreading on social media. And so we may be more apt to take things with a grain of salt. Second, the media are more aware of these efforts to influence voters as well. And I think have done a better job of trying to call out misinformation and maybe not at least amplify the message that is spread. Third, social media companies are more transparent now than they were in the past. In the first half of 2018, Google, Facebook, Twitter all launched ad libraries where you could go search for, say, a particular candidate's name. So I could go in, type Joe Biden in Facebook's ad library. I'd get to see every ad that was sponsored by Joe Biden, but also those ads that mention Joe Biden, maybe some that are attacking him. So I could see who is sponsoring those particular ads, how much they're spending on them. And we can also get some basic information on where those ads are being targeted, okay? All that said, I still have a concern about false news, fake news, fabricated news, misinformation, disinformation, whatever you want to call it. It's still spreading through social media, though the companies have taken some efforts to slow that down in the run-up to our election. There's also a lot of highly slanted news out there. Maybe not complete falsehoods, but they may take a grain of truth in the ad or in the story and then spin it to look really bad for a particular political candidate. And a lot of that is also being spread through social media. And so, how do we defend ourselves against all of this misinformation that is out there? I think one basic thing you can do is consider the source. So if you see maybe in your Facebook feed, the headline, maybe the first couple sentences of an article, figure out where that article is coming from, right? Is it coming from, say, the BBC, which has been around for decades, which employs thousands of journalists all around the globe, whose mission it is to gather news? Or is it coming from a website like InfoWars that has been around for a few years and peddles in conspiracy theories? So source matters. Second, consider how you arrived at that message. So if you're arriving at that message through social media, then it's much more likely to be misinformation than if you were typing in the URL in your browser, for instance, going to WashingtonPost.com, for instance. Third, see if that message can be verified elsewhere. If this is truly a bombshell story that's going to overturn the campaign, then you ought to be able to find it on more than one website. And you ought to be able to find it on the websites of reputable news organizations as well. My fourth piece of advice is to move beyond the headline. Sometimes the most slanted piece of information in a story is the headline because they're trying to draw you in, right? But by the time you get to the fifth paragraph, you realize this is much ado about nothing. Fifth, check the date on the story. Sometimes news is recycled and it takes on a new meaning in a new context. I think it was about a week ago, people were sharing images of Democratic senators gathered together without masks, chiding them for doing so. Well, it turns out the photo was taken more than a year ago, prior to the pandemic. Sixth, gauge your emotional reaction to the story. This is an important one. If it's misinformation, they're trying to get you to have an emotional response to that story. They're trying to make you angry or make you anxious, right? So if you find that your blood pressure is boiling by reading a story, then maybe it's time to step back and consider whether this information is actually true or not. And finally, feel free to use a fact checker. PolitiFact is generally well respected. They're nonpartisan. I believe they're affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania. Snopes.com is a good place to go for some of the more outlandish conspiracy theories that you might find on the web. Not all of them are political, but some of them are. And so that's my advice. I would be happy to take your comments and questions right now.
Once again, I'll be moderating the chat and Q&A functions. If you wish to ask a question, I will be looking at both those functions and then bringing those up to Travis. give people a moment here. That was a really good presentation. I was really interested in kind of those micro-targeting that I kind of know about, but I've never really looked into it. So it was good to learn about that.
Excellent. Yes.
We have a question here from Terry. Do you have any more information about Twitter, or what about Twitter?
Good question. Twitter is not taking paid political advertisements right now. They've decided it really isn't worth the hassle, since they were only making a few $1,000,000 a year on those to begin with. Twitter is a weird space. I think misinformation, this is me being optimistic, may be less likely to spread on Twitter just by the nature of who is on Twitter. There are a lot of journalists on Twitter, a lot of highly knowledgeable individuals on Twitter who may be more likely to call out that misinformation or have competing information. And so it may not be quite the cesspool of some of the other websites, though it is easy for rumors to spread quickly on Twitter as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. We have a question from Amy here. Have you watched the Social Dilemma documentary? I think it's on Netflix. Can you speak about AI's place in this problem?
Yes, the Social Dilemma documentary is in my Netflix queue, but I have not watched it yet, so I need to do that. As far as the role of artificial intelligence, that's an important question, right? I've seen some research that has looked at YouTube, for instance. So you might search for something innocent on YouTube. You see the video, it makes some recommendations. So you click on the next one and watch that. It makes some more recommendations. And by the fourth or fifth recommendation, you've gone from something pretty innocuous, whatever you searched for, to conspiracy theory land. And that's because YouTube directed you in that direction, right? YouTube's main goal is to get you to stay on YouTube as long as possible, okay? As long as you're showing interest in what they're showing, they're going to show you more of that, and maybe even more outlandish, more extreme, in order to keep your eyeballs on that platform. So it's definitely a problem, those algorithms these platforms are using to decide what content you will see.
Yes, I have definitely wasted too much time on YouTube because of that. Here's a kind of good question. I know a lot of people get heated on Facebook, and Donna asked, how do you respond on Facebook to someone who is promoting kind of these ridiculous social media postings? Or I've encountered even someone sharing, outright fake news and posting it as fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's actually some recent research on this that says that calling it out immediately is actually helpful, and it stops the spread of that. So if you just reply, "This is not true," provide a link to maybe a fact checker or an authoritative website, that is a good way to stop tens and hundreds and thousands of other people from not seeing that information. So feel free to call it out and stop it.
Straight, yeah, you gotta call it out and be straight to the point there. Another question here by Sarah Gore. So she's doesn't understand how people can put things out there that is not true. Is that just considered slander, or I'm also curious, there's no repercussions as well besides getting called out. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah, we have, in order to prove a case of libel or slander in the United States against, a public figure such as a politician, it's a very tough standard to meet. You have to show that it's malicious, done intentionally. You knew that it was not true. And frankly, that's difficult to do in a court of law. Frankly, the campaigns themselves say, you know, if we sue over this, that's just going to draw more attention to that misinformation. It's going to mean more people are going to hear that misinformation, which is probably going to backfire. And so it is very difficult, say you're a political figure, to know how to respond to that.
We have another question here from Jack. Do you believe companies such as Cambridge Analytica and other data analysis companies have larger influences in elections within the next 10 to 20 years?
I do think they will. You know, it depends on a couple of things, though. Some of the social media companies are realizing that allowing for kind of unlimited microtargeting is going a step too far. At one point, for instance, on Facebook, you could target Holocaust deniers and neo-Nazi sympathizers. And that's pretty bad publicity for Facebook, right? And so they don't want to enable that. And so now they're only allowing targeting of kind of broader groups. And so that could cut down on some of the influence of that micro-targeting. But at the same time, as you've seen from my figures, the amount of money that's spent on these digital ads just keeps growing and growing and growing each election cycle. And young people no longer watch broadcast television, right? And so you got to get them where they are. And oftentimes that is on social media.
Thank you. Another question here by Kim. Any data on how successful false info in ads are or on social media?
Yeah, we have some studies that have looked at the influence of kind of misinformation on social media. And it seems when that takes on a partisan slant, it's more successful. So we will believe virtually anything if we think that information is coming from someone in our own political party. And it turns out even people who have a lot of political knowledge are just as susceptible to believe that if it comes from people within their own political party. And so that's why sometimes the misinformation about politics has the most influence, because we have those partisan cues. We kind of check our brain and just believe whatever that Republican or Democrat is telling us. So it actually can have a lot of influence on people's thinking.
That makes a lot of sense. If someone in your own party is feeding any misinformation, you're more likely to agree with them on that. Thank you. This is an interesting question. Which social media app is most likely to have the most misinformation or, quote unquote, fake news? Is there one social media app that has more, or do they kind of equally spread this information?
Well, I think there are some that not everyone is exposed to, like 4chan and 8chan and Reddit are some of the worst offenders. Some of those are even based overseas so as to avoid the influence of any US laws. And so that's where you'd want to really, really, really look out for misinformation. As far as, Facebook versus Instagram versus YouTube, You know, I said earlier, I think Twitter might be slightly better in calling out misinformation more quickly. Um, but by and large, I think it also depends on who you're friends with, too, and whether you're clicking on these types of stories. If you click on more of these stories, you're going to be fed more of these stories, right? If you don't click on these stories and you only click on solid news, then you're going to get more solid news. And then Facebook can be a pretty safe place to be. But if you're clicking on all this stuff, then yeah, you're going to be exposed to a lot of misinformation.
It's almost like a trap because some of these headlines will have these very really catchy headlines, like you said, that cause an emotional reaction, and you're clicking on them when you don't really need this information. And so, yes, yes.
Yeah.
um, Another question here: what can Facebook do? How far can it go in terms of policing and this micro targeting or false information? Do freedom of press issues apply to Facebook?
Yeah, in general, no. Facebook has the right to allow whatever it wants on Facebook, right? Um, and so they could say no more misinformation. Now, there's a practical problem, which is that there are probably billions of posts every day on Facebook, right? And so to hire humans to police that would cost Facebook hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Which they're in the business to make money. And so they don't want to do that, right? Um, there are some things that they have done to try to slow the spread of misinformation. Sometimes there will be a tag that an article is disputed. They might have a link right by it to a fact-checking website. So that's one of the techniques that they've taken. Twitter, for instance, in these couple of weeks as we approach the election, they're making it harder to retweet things. They're requiring you to quote tweet, which takes a little longer time to do to try to crack down. I think Facebook groups, they're making it so you can't just send something to, a group of 10,000 individuals, making it harder. So they are taking a few steps to try to crack down on the spread of misinformation.
Thank you. Another question by Victoria. Recently, the news has brought up again how France didn't allow any social media marketing the last 2 days of their country's election, their last election. What are your thoughts on this approach? Do you think it worked as a benefit to the voting public so close to the election?
Yeah, I'm of a couple minds of that. I think one problem is that, this they may have been able to accomplish this 20 years ago, but now, yes, French media companies can't do this, but people are getting information from all around the globe, right? And so it makes it pretty difficult to enforce. Um, Facebook is doing something where the last week of the campaign, they're not allowing campaigns to put up new ads. And so this gives them time to basically make sure that everything up is not filled with misinformation. Um, and that makes sense in a lot of ways, but it also means that, let's say, Donald Trump tweets an attack against Joe Biden with 5 days left. It doesn't give Joe Biden the chance to respond through social media to that particular attack. So it kind of, we have a tendency in the United States to say, well, let's counter speech with more speech. The French obviously have a different approach to this.
Yes, thank you. A question about the 2020 election. What are your thoughts on the influence of social media with the 2020 election?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? And how do we quantify the impact of this? I was doing some research on TikTok, for instance, and realized that, there's all this going on out there among, say, 17-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 22-year-olds, the TikTok celebrities, the paid influencers. All of this is going on, and no one in the media is really paying attention to this. And so, there may be something brewing among young people on social media that the rest of us don't know about, right? On the other hand, maybe, there are no paid ads on TikTok. It's just people saying, I like Trump or I like Biden or whatever, and making their arguments. So I think it's having an impact. The hard part is trying to say how big of an impact it's going to be.
Follow up, do you think after the election there'll be more information on that impact, or is that hard to trace? Is that what you're getting at?
Well, it's hard to trace because no one's systematically collecting the data on who's seen the various TikToks, right? Or how many views they have, or, maybe some political scientist, maybe I should start doing that if there's a way to do so. But at this point, it's so new, we haven't figured out, how do we study this?
Yeah, thank you. Another question from Charlene. Recently, there was a story on Fox News about Biden. However, it didn't show up on any other news station. Can you speak to Fox News and maybe how different broadcasting stations will focus on certain stories?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. There are a lot of kind of mainstream news organizations in the United States, or who try to be nonpartisan, and there are also partisan news sources out there. And obviously, Fox News is a partisan news source. MSNBC is a partisan news source on the left, on the Democratic side. And so it tends to be, I don't say this, as a blanket statement. The difference between Fox and other news organizations is the priorities, their issue priorities. They tend to spend a lot of time focusing on issues that are damaging to Democrats, for instance, and not a lot of time on issues that are damaging to Republicans. And so generally they're not spreading tons of misinformation, at least their news organization part, though some of the commentators are a little loose when it comes to public health messages. But it's really in the issue emphasis where you see the big difference between Fox and other more nonpartisan news organizations.
Thank you. Another question here from Helen. So she's got relatives who get their news from kind of quote unquote hate radio, or radio stations or podcasts that are opinion kind of given, opinion based news. What seems to be the most impartial, reliable news source? And you've mentioned some sources, but can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, if you want kind of impartiality, you want just the facts, then, something like the Associated Press. The Associated Press is a wire service. They produce news that is not going to get them in trouble in any country around the world. They don't want to be seen as having a political agenda because they want to sell these stories to the United States and to China and to South Africa and Europe and everywhere. And so they really tend to stick just to the facts. I think it's useful for Americans to look to international news sources as well. I mentioned the BBC before. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation would be another English language news source that tries to stick to just the facts, right? You know, and a lot of news organizations, you know, you think of the New York Times. Yes, their editorial page definitely leans to the left. The Wall Street Journal, their editorial page leans to the right. But by and large, the news stories that you're going to see in both of those publications are fact-based, right? And so I think there are a lot of good news sources out there. I think it's separating the news from the opinion, and a lot of what you see on cable news channels is opinion.
Thank you. And I just want to apologize for people who have been submitting questions in the chat. My Q&A panel was covering the chat panel, so I haven't been seeing those. But here we have a question from Carrie. Why isn't there any regulation of facts in social media?
Right. I think it's hard to figure out what is a fact sometimes, right? People have their different perceptions of what is fact, what is not fact, right? And, you know, and I don't think a lot of Americans want a government agency that's deciding what's fact, what's not fact, right? And so we tend to leave it more to the free market, to those journalists whom we trust, to try to sort through what is fact and what is not.
Thank you. Another question from Carrie. Do you think that there will be more self-regulation by social media pages like Facebook and Twitter, especially now that we're seeing more conspiracies theories grow because of social media?
I do think we will see some more self-regulation from these companies, in part because they've gotten a lot of political pressure, and they want to make money, and so they will respond to that. We also, if we have a new president and a new Senate, we might see more government regulation of these social media platforms as well. You know, in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, Republican Senate Majority Leader, has in general been opposed to more regulation along these fronts of political advertising, for instance. Democrats, should they take power, would probably be much more open to something like this. And some of the social media companies have said themselves they actually wouldn't mind some government regulation because it just makes things clearer for them. This is what we can do. This is what we can't do. We're not having to write our own rules. Different companies don't have different rules. It would be clear. So I do suspect we'll see more regulation, both governmental and self-regulation.
Thank you. Let's do our one last question here before I have to let you go. You mentioned that creators on TikTok have a lot of political opinions. Do you think the influence of those creators is positive or negative?
Boy, I could see it both ways. You know, if there's an 18-year-old who's never voted before, who's not going to the New York Times each day, but spends hours on social media, that may be a way to expose themselves to some politics, right? Some incidental exposure to some political information. And that could be a really good thing, right? On the other hand, If you're being fed a lot of misinformation on TikTok, there are some paid influencers on TikTok who are working with the political campaigns to influence people's views, and they don't necessarily make that known that they are being paid for that. That does offer up the possibility that you're going to be influenced by that, and that could be negative. So I can see it going both ways. Great question.
Thank you. And, we got through all our questions. That was really awesome. And thanks everyone for submitting your questions. Such great questions for such a really awesome and interesting talk. So thank you, Travis, again. And, we're all, kind of excited, but kind of waiting to see what happens this election. So we'll see.
Thanks so much. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for showing up. I will be emailing our registrants survey for the Washington, the Humanities Speakers Bureau program for Humanities Washington. So please, if you have time, fill that survey out. It really helps them out. Thank you.